Hala Rharrit, an 18-year career diplomat, recently became the first U.S. diplomat to publicly resign over the war on Gaza because of the Biden administration's financial, military, and diplomatic backing of Israel. Hala served as the Arabic language spokesperson for the State Department in the region.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview with Majalla. It's a pleasure to have you, Hala Rharrit. As we talked about, we're going to discuss largely your resignation from the State Department as the first Foreign Service officer in April, but I want to start with getting to know you a little bit better. And so I'll begin with this question. Can you tell us about your upbringing, where are you from, and how did you become interested in American foreign policy?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me on your program. It's a pleasure. So I began to be interested in U.S. foreign policy from a very early age. I was always interested and fascinated by politics, and particularly the role of diplomacy. I've always believed that people-to-people contacts and exchanges were the key to harmony in societies and in countries writ large. So I am actually the daughter of immigrants. I was born in Morocco, and my family immigrated when I was very young to the United States. And so I felt like a natural diplomat when I was very young, because I was obviously from one country, moved to another, and felt like a representative of both. So when I was very, very young and I would go back to Morocco to visit relatives, I represented the US. And then, when I was in the US, everyone would ask me questions about Morocco. So I think it naturally lent itself to being interested in international relations. And unfortunately, there was also conflict. I moved, and shortly thereafter, my family moved, I should say, shortly thereafter, the Iraq war started. And even though Morocco was very, very far removed from the events of Iraq, because of my Arab heritage, I got a lot of questions from American friends as to what was happening in the Arab world. And it sort of forced me to educate myself as to what was going on, whereas my Moroccan relatives had really no idea what was going on in Iraq because it was so geographically far. But being in the United States sort of forced me to learn more than I probably would have learned had I just stayed living in Casablanca. So when I was in high school, I was part of the debate team. I was part of the International Baccalaureate program. I was a very hardworking student, and I actually went on a leadership program to Washington. I think I must have been a junior in high school, and I fell in love. I fell in love with Washington, D.C. I thought it was exactly where I needed to go. It was sort of a mock model UN type of program. So we got to play diplomats a little bit during that leadership program. And I decided then that I was only going to apply to universities in Washington for my undergraduate degree. And that's what I did. So I studied at George Washington University for my undergrad, and I studied international affairs and Middle Eastern studies. And then I did my master's at Georgetown at the School of Foreign Service. And then I obviously joined the State Department. So a very straightforward path towards the diplomatic corps.
And you were in the Foreign Service as a diplomat, is that correct? Were you
That is correct.
The whole time an Arabic language spokesperson, or what other roles did you have throughout your 18 years working at the State Department?
No, so I only was the Arabic language spokesperson as of 2022. I think I joined in August. So as diplomats, we move every 2 to 3 years, depending on the length of assignment. When we're what we call junior officers or entry-level officers, our assignments are typically 2 years. And then when we get into the mid-range and senior range, our assignments are typically 3 years, unless you go to what we call a hardship post. So no, I moved all around the world throughout my 18 years. I started out in Yemen as a political and human rights officer, which was an absolutely thrilling and enriching experience. I unfortunately survived 3 terrorist attacks myself in Sana'a against the US mission and our housing compound. So I was evacuated twice. That was the first assignment. So that was quite a tough intro into the Foreign Service. And then after that, I went to Hong Kong. And I served as a consular officer. So every diplomat needs to do a consular tour. which is basically visas or American citizen services. So going, you can imagine, from Sana'a to Hong Kong, two cities that are probably total opposites as far as you can get in terms of so many things, from the wealth gap to, just to rural versus urban, just so many different things. And then after Hong Kong, I served in Qatar as deputy political economic chief. I had a lot of tours. I also served in South Africa as a political economic chief in Durban. So this gives you an idea. As diplomats, we really go around the world, but my regional expertise was in the Arab world, but I also served outside of the Arab world as well.
Were there a lot of moments of disappointments in that career that you had? Did you feel like by and large you were doing important work that was being heard and that you were having an influence? I just want to build up to this moment of resignation that we'll eventually focus on, but I'm curious, within the 18 years that you were there, what your sort of experience was, if you ever envisioned one day you would resign, or if you were pretty content with the role that you had and the work that you were doing.
I definitely never envisioned that I would resign like this. I thought that maybe I would, eventually retire, but not this prematurely. So if you mean that I have issues or concerns with policies before, sure. I mean, I think every diplomat does, right? We, no country is perfect, no policies are perfect, but that's also why I wanted to be a diplomat, and why I felt like it was a responsibility and a privilege to be able to serve the American people and be able to work within government to try to affect change. And so throughout my 18 years, of course, there were issues that I perhaps had concerns about, but I never felt hopeless. I never felt helpless. But this particular policy made me feel both of those things. And for me, as an American diplomat, with this particular policy, it became that I could no longer maintain the role that I was in. And before that, I had never felt that before. I always felt like there was more for me to do from the inside, that my voice would better be used inside the State Department rather than outside. So in that sense, this was unprecedented for me, and obviously led to my resignation.
Thank you. So let's move now to the somber topic of October 7th and the war on Gaza that subsequently took place. I want to hear a little bit about your reaction on October 7th and following up to that, of what were you immediately doing in your capacity as a diplomat after October 7th? A lot of us, a lot of people who know and have watched how Israel has reacted in the past in their policies towards Gaza, and especially with the far right government right now, were terrified about what was going to come. But I don't think anyone really envisioned this level of savage brutality. And I'm curious how you reacted and what you were thinking and what you were trying to do in the days leading post October 7th.
Well, I was horrified on October 7th, like many of my colleagues across the region, across the world. We watched what was happening and what was unfolding in southern Israel with horror. And, my heart broke for the civilians, for the Israeli civilians that were taken hostage, that were killed. It was a horrific terrorist attack that obviously needs to be condemned, because it is never just to attack civilians, no matter what side of the border they may be on, and no matter where they're from. And I oppose that quite strongly. So as my role as a spokesperson, what we do and what we did is, whenever there's a crisis, whether it was the earthquake in Turkey or Syria, or whether it was this terrorist attack, we always monitor. And we monitor what's happening, and we also report back to Washington what's happening in the region. So what we were monitoring initially on October 7th throughout pan-Arab media was also horror at what was happening, and a lot of the Israeli victims were being humanized on a lot of Arab networks. There were profiles of a grandma that was kidnapped, or there was sympathy towards the Israeli victims. But I can tell you that quickly changed. And that changed once Israel began to conduct its operation in a way which caused mass civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, on the Gaza front. And so we were also reporting this and documenting this back to Washington. And so typically as spokespeople, we always wait for Washington to get out first on any type of messaging. Any type of official messaging needs to first come out from Washington. And then as foreign language spokespeople, we then go out and amplify, usually when the dust settles, usually when things calm down a little. But with this particular crisis, as we all see, the dust never settled. It's never calmed down. It's continuously gotten worse and worse and worse. Even when you think it can't get any worse, it somehow does. So we were getting the talking points and asked to amplify in Arabic. And then I read the talking points and I said, I can't amplify these on the Arabic language media markets. For one, they really didn't acknowledge the plight of the Palestinians. They dehumanized Palestinians in many regards, or dismissed the gravity of the situation on the Palestinian side. And this was throughout. It started shortly after, but then this was throughout. So that's what I started documenting back to Washington.
What were those talking points? Could you give some specific examples?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, it was all of the talking points that you were hearing coming out of the White House and out of the State Department and continue to hear, right? So it's Israel has a right to defend itself, of course. Yes, Israel has the right to defend itself, but then what happens on the other side? What about all of the Palestinians that are getting massacred and the civilian deaths? So there was vast inequality in the type of way everything was being documented. And a lot of those talking points, keep in mind, are written for a U.S. domestic audience. So perhaps it was okay in those very, very early days to go out and talk strictly October 7th and strictly talk about, Israel's right to defend itself. But when we're talking to an Arab audience who has the historical context, who understands a lot more about the region, and also is seeing live streamed on their phones massacres of hundreds and hundreds, and very quickly thousands of Palestinians getting killed, and there's very, very little about that in our talking points. Or even worse, in the early days, President Biden tried to minimize the Palestinian civilian death toll, and he basically publicly stated, we have doubt in these numbers. That was horrific. There was no way that I could go out on Arab media and amplify that. Right. There was a lot of also the things that we continue to hear today, that Hamas uses civilians as human shields. OK, fine. But does that make it OK that hundreds and very quickly thousands of civilians were killed, when Arabs also very well know that when Israel wants to conduct certain operations of assassinations, they're able to do it and not cause mass civilian casualties? It was also very problematic because what I was documenting had implications on the United States. So I was documenting and reporting back to Washington the images and videos that were going viral. And many of them, or some of them at the very least, pointed to U.S. complicity. So they would show that civilians, many times children, and then fragments of U.S.-made bombs next to them. So my messaging back to Washington all the time is that this policy is hurting the United States. It's not just Israel that's being blamed for the death toll in Gaza, the civilian death toll in Gaza, but it's also America, and we have to tread very, very lightly here.
Yes, and you talked about how there is a shift in Arab media from initial sympathy towards Israeli victims towards this sort of rising, perhaps, anti-Americanism that you were tracing and conveying, and that it was falling on dead ears, and that you eventually felt hopeless and helpless, and that is what led to your resignation 6 months later after 18 years as working as a diplomat. I'm wondering, was there a specific moment in April where you woke up and said, I have to resign today? Was there a specific incident that led to that, or was it the accumulation of those 6 months, or both? Could you sort of walk me into that process and the rationale and sort of how you went about that day of resigning. I know that must have been a really difficult decision for you.
It was a very, very difficult decision that I kept on going back and forth on. I can tell you there were many, many, many days where I woke up and I said, okay, that's it. I have to resign. There was always a little voice that kept on saying, okay, what if you resign, then, this is not helping anything or anyone that, Washington needs to hear. The reality is coming from the region, and it's your responsibility to do so. And you have to stay in and do that. And it's in service to your country. And I was having actually fellow diplomats, including senior ones, saying it's times like these that you're needed the most. And, we need your expertise and all of that. So that kept me in for some time. But then also I was very much silenced and I was very much sidelined. And my expertise was rejected and pushed to the side by many who just didn't want to hear about it, who didn't want to hear the realities of the region, who didn't want to hear about the growth in anti-Americanism, who didn't want to hear about the ramifications of our policy throughout the region, and the fact that this policy was indeed bad for America, fundamentally bad for America.
Can you talk about that a little bit? How were the policies in this war have affected US's standing and security in the region? Do you have any examples about that from since the 8 months of the war when it broke out?
Sure. I'll give you a very simple example. So before October 7th, I myself had done over 100 interviews on pan-Arab media on a range of topics: Russia, Ukraine, the conflict in Sudan, whatever it may be, even the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, whatever issue it may be. After, we couldn't really talk about anything. So the implications were far-flung. We could no longer talk about Russia, Ukraine, because we lost all credibility there. The feedback from the region was, oh, so you value a Ukrainian life more than you value a Palestinian life. We couldn't talk about Sudan because why do you care about that genocide but not the genocide of the Gazans? We couldn't talk about human rights anymore. How could you speak about human rights when you're enabling the mass killings of civilians? How can you talk about press freedom when you remain willfully silent on the killing of over 100 journalists, right? So it's across the board. And I'll add, it's not just political implications. Like I noted, of the rise of anti-Americanism, it has serious security implications. 3 of our service members in Jordan were killed because of this policy, right? That was a direct.
Whom? When was that?
This was. I'm sorry?
Yeah, could you talk about that incident? I know I remember reading about it, but just for our viewers, can you remind us what happened and was this a result of this war on Gaza?
Yeah, it was Iraqi militias that had vowed revenge for the policy in Gaza, and they kept on trying until finally they succeeded. We also had to evacuate our embassy in Iraq twice, I believe. Had to draw down our embassy again because of threats. Because of threats to our own diplomatic staff and to our own personnel. So again, the implications of this policy are far-reaching. Also, our economic ties. I mean, everybody has seen the effects of the boycott movement, but also beyond the boycott movement, there have been a lot of businesses that have no longer wanted to affiliate themselves with the United States or with the U.S. Embassy. Even education ties. Students across the region don't want to go study in the United States anymore, and their parents don't want to send their kids to America anymore like before. So whether you're talking about political, security, economic ramifications, it's great. But I would say the biggest thing was people's across the region, their disappointment in us, their utter disappointment in us that we would not only enable, but really be complicit in these mass killings through our constant funneling of weapons to the state of Israel, despite the ICJ's ruling of plausible genocide, despite basically every international and humanitarian organization saying and demanding a ceasefire very early on, and talking about just the devastation on Palestinian civilians, on the civilians themselves, and the fact that we have willfully maintained this policy despite all of that, I think has really broken the hearts of so many across the region, that despite all of the troubles of the past, still believed in America and what we stood for, but they can no longer believe in us. And that, for me as an American diplomat, was also heartbreaking.
Yeah, and you have an inside perspective perhaps into this intransigence of the US being totally handcuffed to Israel and still funneling weapons, etc. How did you understand that? Or how are you able to explain why the US, why Biden and Blinken fundamentally did not try to pressure Netanyahu and the Israeli government to stop this war earlier on, or at any times,
Yeah.
really? Why has the US not, when it's in terms of obviously morally and ethically, it's lost so much of its credibility, the American government, as you've outlined, but also from a real politics standpoint as well, that this is actually fundamentally bad for America from a realist perspective. And so
Absolutely.
that's very persuasive. I'm very persuaded by that in this interview. Why were your messages? How did you understand the inability of Washington to hear and comprehend and act on these messages?
Because this policy was coming straight from the top, directly from the top. And it was not being influenced by the field or by its diplomats, right? And so many times, obviously, it's always the president or the secretary of state or senior policymakers that decide a policy, but many times your experts, your ambassadors, your diplomats, and not just in the State Department, your entire interagency, they feed in to the formulation of that policy. But that's not the case with this one. It's coming directly from the top, and the rest of us are just strictly implementers. I asked myself that question so many times before I decided to resign, sort of what is forcing the president and Secretary Blinken to maintain the insanity of this policy, despite the fact that you have the families of hostages in Israel, the families of the hostages protesting and demanding a ceasefire. This was still back in the day before President Biden was requesting a ceasefire, when he was, still opposed to a ceasefire. You already had the families of the hostages very early on protesting against the Netanyahu government, saying, enough with the violence, you're going to kill our own people. There needs to be a diplomatic solution to this. Enough with the violence, stop. And so this is just my, what I gathered and what I determined to be the reason. And I really boiled it down to three things. For one, I think it's ideology. President Biden is a self-proclaimed Zionist, and he believes in the quote unquote ironclad commitment of the United States with Israel, which, by the way, I never had an issue with. I became a diplomat very well understanding that, Israel is one of our strongest allies in the region. But there are also laws. There's also international law. There's also US law. So that takes me to my second point. So if you believe truly in the ironclad commitment of Israel with the United States, then as an ally, the United States should also ensure that Israel will also be safe. But this policy in no way ensures Israel's safety or security. What it actually does is ensure a generational cycle of violence, because when you have 20,000 orphans in Gaza, who in their right mind is going to think that they're not going to seek revenge, and vice versa? It's just a never-ending cycle of violence. So the idea that this policy is there to ensure Israel's security, I don't buy it. It doesn't make any rational sense. So that now takes me to my second point, which is the influence of domestic politics on our foreign policy. And this is something, as a diplomat, I could not ignore. The influence of the arms industry. A lot of people talk about the influence of AIPAC. Of course, that's abundantly clear on our politicians and other pro-Israeli lobbying groups, but also of the arms industry. And when you have politicians on both sides of the aisle receiving campaign contributions, and they are the same politicians that are determining whether or not to send more arms to a country, I think we as Americans have to ask ourselves, is that in the United States' best interest? Or is that in the best interest of those particular politicians? Because as a diplomat, and it wasn't just me, it was many of us that were reporting back to Washington the ramifications and the dangers of this policy on the United States. Yet we continue to dig our heels in and maintain the steady flow of weaponry, despite and I want to state this very clearly, a violation of US law. That's also another reason why I resigned, because it was clear violation of US law.
What
And
is
I'm happy
that?
to get into that more.
Yeah, what is that law? Please get into that.
Sure. So there are actually many laws. So there's the Leahy vetting, which has to ensure that no one that receives any type of military assistance, personnel, including training, have not committed any human rights abuses. So when I worked in Qatar, for example, the Leahy vetting process was a very arduous process, and you have to go name by name. There are exceptions to this rule for Israel. It's basically waived, which is insane, considering the amount of lethal weaponry that they receive from us, and training and other forms of military assistance. And then there's also the Arms Export Control Act, which again states that arms have to be used in a defensive nature. You know, you cannot argue that 2,000-pound bombs on a civilian population is used in defensive in a defensive way. It is intent to massacre those civilians. So it's in clear violation of the Arms Export Control Act. There's also the Foreign Assistance Act, which part of that act signifies that if a country obstructs humanitarian assistance from civilians in need, then they are also not authorized to receive U.S. weapons. I mean, these are all very complicated, but all on open source, and I would encourage all your readers to look into all of these laws. And there are others. There's the National Security Memorandum. There's a lot. But what I saw is a willful violation of all of those laws, and that politicians were also benefiting financially from this policy and were being influenced by this policy. And then the third thing that made me think, why is this policy so intransigent, and why is it so, is, to be quite frank, racism, for lack of better words, just bluntly. I saw very clearly in the talking points in the policy that a Palestinian life was not valued the same way that an Israeli life was, that Palestinian children were not valued the same way that Ukrainian children were. I saw it in my talking points. That's why I refuse to deliver those talking points. And we see it in the policy. We see it in our senior officials that insist on continuing weapons flow to Israel, despite 15,000 children killed. Over 15,000 children killed. It's absolute madness. After we see with our own eyes children burned alive in refugee tents, there is another way for Israel to, quote unquote, defend itself. There is another way to even achieve its military objectives against Hamas. Doing this is not the only option, unless you don't value lives in Gaza, unless you are okay with the fact that 40,000 people have been killed. So those were really the 3 points that made me think, okay, there's no way I'm personally going to be able to affect change on this policy from within, and also led to my particular resignation.
Thanks. And when you were talking about the arms flow and the willful enabling of the crimes on Democracy Now!, you also mentioned that these were continuing just under the threshold that Congress would have to consider. Could you talk about this point? I think it's very important.
Yeah. I mean, this has been throughout the conflict, and it was actually quite shocking to me. I was in Washington last week, and I met with members of Congress, and I met with congressional staffers, and they were complaining of the same thing, that they wanted, some of them actually wanted, to have oversight. Some of them wanted to take action and halt weapons shipment to Israel based on concerns of mass civilian casualties, but they couldn't, because the State Department was sending it just right under the threshold, allowing them to proceed without any type of congressional accountability, which again, to me, is willfully enabling this policy, knowing how horrific it is, but trying to get away with it. And it's really, it's inexcusable. It's absolutely inexcusable.
Were people in the US State Department ever using the word ethnic cleansing?
Yes. I mean, not officially, right? We were using it amongst each other to describe what was happening, to question what was happening. But is it official US policy? No.
Official US policy is a two-state solution, which has been the policy since President Jimmy Carter and amongst American elites for decades now. And Biden recently reiterated that as well. But yet that is something that totally goes against what Netanyahu's government espouses. So it's very complicated and confusing. Well, really not. Do you feel like this two-state solution is merely just words and rhetoric, but what actually they're doing, therefore, is enabling this ethnic cleansing?
Look, so I don't think that the US government is saying that they believe in a two-state solution just out of, I want to be careful here. So I'll just say this. When President Biden became president, he was very forward-leaning on the Palestinian issue. You know, he reinstated UNRWA funding. That was one of the first things that he did after President Trump, canceled funding to UNRWA. He also, for the first time, instituted a brand new position in the State Department called the U.S. Envoy for Palestinian Affairs. That was the first time ever to have such a senior diplomat working directly on Palestinian issues, right? So there is, I believe, a true understanding and recognition within the State Department that the only permanent solution to this is a two-state solution. I do think that you have Netanyahu who is of that and trying to undermine that in every way, shape, and form. I believe Netanyahu wants to commit ethnic cleansing. Somehow he has convinced American officials that that is not his true intent. Because when I was having conversations with senior officials within the State Department, they recognize what's happening in Gaza. They recognize how horrific it is, but they cannot recognize that Netanyahu's intent is actually ethnic cleansing. And to me, I'm like, how are you not seeing this? The forced starvation of an entire population, war crime. The destruction of entire civilian infrastructure to make the whole territory uninhabitable, not allowing foreign journalists in to document what's happening. I mean, the targeting of journalists themselves that are already there, right? There's so much you can say about how it is abundantly clear that it's ethnic cleansing. You have historians that have written books on ethnic cleansing, Holocaust survivors that are calling it a genocide and ethnic cleansing. But the administration refuses to acknowledge that. But I think in doing so, they would also, that would elicit US complicity. And I think that's one step too far. So that's why you're always hearing the line, Israel has a right to defend itself. Because if you maintain that this is strictly defense, then it's lawful. Mm-hmm. But once you drop that, and once you sort of admit, I think the real goal of Netanyahu and the far right in Israel to ethnically cleanse Gaza of the Palestinians, the US will no longer be able to publicly support that, right? So they're never gonna get that far. But again, that just points to our own double standards, because we can't uphold international law in one instance and then criticize it in another just because it's our ally that's violating those laws.
Mm-hmm. And Israel's rhetoric obviously is very much, in addition to self-defense, that goes along with defeating Hamas. Is this something that the US government believes is still possible? What does that even mean to militarily defeat Hamas?
Yeah, well, you've heard it directly from the president and from Secretary Blinken that they don't believe that a military defeat of Hamas is possible. These are not my words, those are theirs. What I was documenting back to Washington was that this policy actually had the opposite effect of its intended goal, that it was strengthening Hamas's popularity throughout the Arab world in countries that never favored Hamas at all. You're seeing demonstrations in countries like Morocco and Tunisia where they're all of a sudden raising Hamas flags, and that was never the case before. These are secular Arab countries that never had any type of Islamist leaning or pro-Hamas sentiment, but because of the mass civilian casualties, because of the horrors that people are seeing on their phones streamed daily, it's almost a violent reaction to that. And so my warning to the State Department was continuously, you are literally creating exactly what you are trying to oppose. This policy is not working. Reverse course. And now you heard from President Biden where he very clearly said, even in the argument of self-defense, Hamas no longer has the ability to conduct an October 7th again. That was from President Biden himself from the podium. So then what's happening now in Gaza? If we've already heard from the president that Hamas has basically been defeated in terms of not being able to repeat October 7th, right? Which was always, they want to make sure that that never happens again. And President Biden has already said they can't do it. So what's happening? What's the point of this continuous military onslaught that is killing civilians? Really, it's massacring civilians, it's massacring children every day. And I may add, we continue to send weapons to Israel even after President Biden's announcement.
You were in Washington last week and you talked to senior officials in the State Department, and I was wondering if you had any insights as to the day after plan in terms of the ceasefire proposal and what people in the department are discussing in terms of what will happen to Gaza in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, so I was in Washington last week. I was invited to speak at the launch event for an organization called Middle East Democracy Center. And I also took advantage of the week to do some advocacy in Congress and colleagues and some senior officials of the State Department. Look, I think the focus was so much on getting to a ceasefire and the frustration that no one has been able to get to a ceasefire, that the conversations were mostly focused on that. The day after plan, I mean, you've seen it in President Biden's, the plan that he outlined for a ceasefire in terms of a reconstruction phase. And obviously, the administration is always in favor of supporting the Palestinian Authority and trying to regain political momentum, on behalf of the Palestinians. But I think before we get to the day after, we just need to get to a stop of a cessation of hostilities, really a ceasefire. And my point on the Hill and in the department was, we're not going to be able to effect a ceasefire, despite whatever rhetoric is coming out of the White House or the State Department. You heard President Biden very, very forcefully say it's time for the war to end. He said it from the podium. That is supposed to carry weight, but it didn't. You had, which is very frustrating, and it's an embarrassment, to be quite honest. You had Benjamin Netanyahu come out shortly thereafter undermining what President Biden said, despite all of the military assistance that we provide and the diplomatic cover that we provide. Benjamin Netanyahu comes out and she just undermines President Biden's call for a ceasefire. And then you have Hamas take a very long time and then eventually reply and ask for, from what is reported in the press, more conditions. And then you see the administration very frustrated. It is a very expected outcome when you are not using your diplomatic leverage, when you continue to give an Israeli far-right government everything that they ask for practically. How do you expect them to yield to your requests for a negotiation, for a ceasefire, for a cessation of hostilities. President Biden himself said it was in Netanyahu's interest to keep this war going for his own political gain. And so when you're not pressuring and using leverage by cutting military assistance, he has no reason to support it, and he did everything he could to undermine it. And the same goes on the other side, right? So we need to give our Arab allies like Qatar and Egypt something to be able to pressure Hamas with as well. If we are able to cut our military assistance in line with US law, and I'll stress that, in line with US law, that will give us diplomatic leverage, and then they'll be able to also pressure Hamas to make concessions and agree to a ceasefire. But before we're willing to use our diplomatic leverage, I don't see how we're going to get to a ceasefire. And it's very, very frustrating and heartbreaking to see the continuous massive civilian casualties in Gaza.
I'd like to turn our attention now just to your understanding of media, how the Arab world, as you saw it, has been reporting on the war and the images they've been showing versus the Western US mainstream media has been portraying that. Did you see a disconnect in the different ways of reporting on this war, and does that have an impact on shifting perceptions or on US American consciousness, or is social media really this leveling field that is allowing everybody similar access into what is happening in Gaza?
Yeah, there's been a big difference in the way Arab media and US media report what's happening in Gaza. For one, I think that pretty much every Arab outlet, I mean, I may be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure most, if not all, Arab outlets call what's happening in Gaza a genocide. There's no question about it. Ibada jama'iyya in Arabic, ethnic cleansing, a genocide. It's not questioned because mostly people have been watching it unfold with their own eyes. Whereas I think in Western media, that word is, people are still not comfortable using it. You have certain programs like Democracy Now! Have very much been covering in detail what's been happening in Gaza. They use it, but in terms of mainstream media, it's rare that you will have that level of acknowledgement of what's actually happening in Gaza. So that's just one example of the difference between the two, right? But in terms of social media, you're absolutely right. It has been a complete game changer with this particular conflict, I think, in the Arab world, but also globally. Traditional pan-Arab media outlets have focused on Gaza, but no outlet can focus on it the way social media has, because it's been so raw, it's been uncensored, it's been so graphic, and I think it's been viral throughout the Arab world, but also the world, which I think has caused so many protests across the entire world. Obviously, we've seen the student protests in the United States, but also in Europe and Australia, really everywhere. Because when people see images on a daily basis of children getting massacred, I can't even, begin to tell you, and I'm sure you've seen them as well. I was watching and documenting all of the viral images because I was sending them back. Some of them I was sending them back in daily reports to the department. So I was watching it on a very gruesome daily day by day, seeing what was happening. And I think it's traumatizing for so many around the world. And I think that's what caused so many to erupt and protest, that when they're seeing innocent civilians get massacred and governments, whether it is the British government or the US government, insist on continuously funding and supporting an armed forces that continues this onslaught, it's heart-wrenching. And I think the role of social media in that has been extremely powerful, because you're hearing directly from the Gazans who are literally live streaming what their experiences are, and it goes straight into people's homes.
U.S. elections are coming up. I want to hear from you how you think this war will play a role or affect the elections, namely if you think Trump's position differs much from Biden's with regards to the war on Gaza.
That's a really good question. I think this will have a huge impact on the election, one that I think the Democrats are not realizing as much. I think they are in denial. I think they want to believe, oh, Trump is so bad, everybody will come out and vote for Biden at the end of the day, even if they're still mad at at Biden now, right? They think that they're going to regain the votes come November, and I think they're very, very wrong about that. We've seen the uncommitted movement, which began in Michigan, spread throughout the entire country. There are uncommitted delegates. It's a formidable force, and I think the Democratic Party is really underestimating the significance, especially in swing states like Michigan and others that really have the ability to make the election go one way or another. In terms of your question on whether on this particular policy, Trump and Biden differ, I honestly don't think they do. I think some people will be shocked in hearing me say that, but I think they don't. I think the only way they differ is in rhetoric, is in talking points, to be quite frank. And I say that as a former spokesperson. This administration is good about talking about how much they care about the Palestinians. We're concerned about the plight of Palestinians. We're worried about this. We're concerned about that. But when it comes to action, what are the actions taking place? Continuous funneling of U.S. weaponry, lethal weaponry. In terms of humanitarian assistance, they boast about, parachute airdrops, which really were, for me, I reported this back to the State Department, how vilified we were when we did the parachute drops, because it was almost worse than not doing anything at all, because it was seen as an insult to people's intelligence. It was seen as completely a PR stunt. If you actually wanted to feed people who were undergoing famine and mass starvation, a few parachute drops was not going to cut it. You needed to put pressure on Israel in order to actually allow aid trucks in, hundreds upon hundreds of aid trucks that were waiting at the border. And so I think it's about rhetoric and wanting to appear a certain way, but I think when it comes down to action, practical action, I don't see much difference between the two administrations. And again, it goes back to both sides of the aisle are, for lack of a better word, bought, on this policy. That's a controversy. As a diplomat, I can't help but see that abundantly across both political parties.
Hopeless, helpless, you couldn't enact change from the inside. And so in April, you resigned. It's been 2 months now. What are you doing to bring forth the message of the humanity of the Palestinians? What sort of work are you engaged with now that you're outside of the administration?
Yeah, it sounds so sad that you said I felt helpless and hopeless. Even hearing it makes me sad, and it was me going through it, but just hearing it makes me sad. I have not lost hope in humanity. I can say that. I have not lost hope in the American people. And I don't want to lose hope in our administration and our government. I can tell you that. So I've maintained my advocacy. I've actually been very busy since resigning. Surprisingly, it's gotten a lot of media attention. So I've been very busy doing all of that. And I find it a responsibility. It's like a responsibility to get the word out, to try to explain, also to try to explain to the American people how this is not about us versus them, or what side you're on, or pro this or pro that. It really should not be about that. It should be about, how can we have a humane policy? How can we ensure peace? And this is not the way to do it. And this is a policy that is fundamentally undermining U.S. interests, U.S. credibility. It's a failed militaristic policy that is not keeping Israelis any safer, and obviously causing absolute devastation for the Palestinians. So, like I mentioned, I was on the Hill last week having meetings with members and with staffers. I had meetings at the State Department. I'm going to just keep doing whatever I can whenever I get asked. And I'm trying to be proactive in getting all of the messaging out, because the status quo is just not acceptable. And we've seen reports that, half the population of Gaza is supposed to begin to starve to death by next month. This cannot be on our watch. It just can't. As American taxpayers, forget about me being a diplomat. As just an American taxpayer, it can't be on our watch. We can't let this happen. We just can't. So, I'm just going to keep trying to be a voice for peace. And in that, I've been also speaking to some Israeli peace activists as well, and trying to amplify their voices, because there are many within Israel that also recognize how horrific this policy is. And so, there is strength in numbers, and working with other folks that have also resigned, we're trying to do as much as we can together as a collective to try to raise awareness and put pressure on this policy.
Thank you so much, Hala Rharrit. I really enjoyed speaking with you. We could keep talking forever, but our time has come to an end. Thank you for speaking to Al Majalla.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.